Today is a list of things I'd like to see changed in Nikon's next mirrorless camera. Well, hey everyone, it's Hudson. Welcome to this week's Approaching the Scene. I want to just jump in and dispel any questions about why I have this red band on my arm. I just went and gave blood. I heard on the radio that there's a little bit of a shortage, what with everyone sheltering in place and people being nervous. And I have a relatively rare blood type, so I thought I would go and contribute in some way instead of just contributing by staying around home in the studio. So I want to give a big shout out and thanks to everyone who's been watching these videos, being part of the community. Again, this whole video series is really driven by what everyone who's watching it wants to know about. So please contribute your questions. You can give me questions in the comments section here on the YouTube video, or you can email me or reach out through social media, however you prefer to communicate. Or join in my office hours. I had a great office hour with Rick LePage this last week. It's a free meeting session for everybody who's got a little extra time on their hands right now to just get together and talk things photographic, and we do a Q&A and it's live over Zoom. You can sign up for that at www.hudsonhenry.com/office hours. And we threw down a little challenge for this next Wednesday, or next Tuesday, the first office hour in May, to go out with a single focal length. Whether you're using a zoom, if you're using a zoom lens, lock it at a single focal length and look, limit yourself to that. It's like an assignment. Work with one focal length, kind of old school. Capture an image and share that one image with us. It's got to be captured this week. When you sign up for the office hours, there'll be a portal to upload that image, about a 2,000 pixel JPEG, and we'll go through those images in the meeting and talk about them a little bit. All right, so I want to talk about the Nikon mirrorless system and what I'd like to see changed a little bit as it evolves. Anybody who's been following me knows that I absolutely love the Z6 and the Z7. I have been a long time diehard DSLR, you got to pry it from my hand kind of a guy. I dabbled in the original Panasonic Micro Four Thirds offerings way back when, and then I played around a little bit with some of the Fuji's APS-C stuff, and I dabbled a bit in Sony's A7 series of full-frame mirrorless, and nothing ever felt quite as good or as easy to use to me. It didn't feel like a tool that worked better and made it easier for me to capture quality images than my tried and true DSLRs, and that was particularly true once I got my hands on the Nikon D850, which I still love. That changed when I bought a Nikon Z6 to kind of test and try out. I fell in love with the clarity and abilities that beautiful new electronic viewfinder afforded me. And just there were certain things about it that I just absolutely adore, and it feels like it is an enhanced tool to me. It actually makes my life easier, and it's intuitive to use. There are still some things that are imperfections though, and some things I'd love to see them address a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm using a little Adamus Ninja 5 external recorder. It takes the HDMI signal out of my Nikon Z7 here and feeds it in, and I can show you what's going on the screen while I talk. And I'm going to run through a few things that I think could improve the camera. Number one is just the available view options doesn't have a clear view, whether you're looking through the viewfinder or the back LCD. And what I mean by that is just an uncluttered view of your scene. I'd love to have a view where it's just the autofocus point or focus peaking if you're manually focusing, and your image. And what I see, no matter as I cycle through here, I've got my settings view, and this is the same basic views if I'm looking through the viewfinder or on the back LCD like I am right now. And as I scroll through, I've got this one with kind of all the information about my shooting settings. This one that is part of the information, just kind of exposure information. A live histogram, and we're back to the level. So those are my options. And if you go through the list of options in the settings, there's not one to have a completely clear view of your subject. And I think that's a real simple fix. That could even come in firmware to the Z6 and the Z7, and I'm not the only one asking for this. I've heard other people ask about it too. Another is something that I noticed right off the bat. It's the ability to preview depth of field beyond smaller apertures than f5.6 in live view, zoomed in on your subject. That's a kind of a mouthful. I've got a whole video about it I'm going to link. And if you click on the YouTube video's title and scroll down, you'll see a whole list of links I put in. I'm going to link that video about fix this depth of field issue, please, Nikon. It's not a deal breaker for me, but I mean, for years I worked with film cameras, and there was just a preview lever, and everything got dark as the lens actually stopped down, and you got kind of a guesstimate of what the world would look like through that narrower aperture. And you'd see your depth of field, what all's in focus at a given aperture. Well, with the live view getting better and better in the DSLRs, it became this really cool thing because you actually saw whatever aperture was going to be your final shooting aperture as you set up in live view and focused your scene. And so I could focus on the closest thing that I want razor sharp in a landscape or in a macro or in a still life photo, and then slowly change the focus until I focus further away until I start losing that quality of focus. Zoomed in at 100%, looking in the back, and then come back to where it's just barely sharp, and I know I've spread my focus as far out in the scene as I can. I can then check the background and see if I need to do some focus stacking or use a smaller aperture yet. It was a great tool, especially when you're zoomed in to that live digital view of what the sensor's seeing. You'd think with the Z6 and Z7 I could do that through the eye viewfinder without reading glasses or anything, but sadly, they didn't go with that. I'm going to turn on these little Lume cubes. I got a Lume Cube 2 to kind of be a main light here on this little rocket blower. And then I've got a Lume Cube panel light to kind of just evenly light this thing up a bit. And I'm going to just bring my focus point over here and focus on the blower. And we're at f1.8. So the background's really blown here. And if I zoom in, here's what I'm talking about. I can see we are razor sharp on the logo here for the rocket blower. Now if I start stopping down, well, you'll see what I'm talking about. We start seeing details in the background coming into focus all the way up to f5.6. At f5.6, however, it stops having any effect. It's locked. It's not going to show me a smaller aperture than f5.6. If I hit the depth of field preview lever, that's this F1 button on the front, well, now all of a sudden I can see the effect. It'll stop down and give me a live view of that. I thought, well, maybe if we move our focus point out to something important to us like the background here and zoom in on that and then hit the depth of field, nope, it goes back to 100%. I can't zoom in and check depth of field at my final aperture. Whereas the default in my Nikon D850 or D500 or any of my prior DSLRs is to just show me that aperture as I stop down. If I hit what's normally a depth of field preview lever looking through the optical viewfinder, what it does is opens the aperture up wide to make it easier to focus with less noise in the live view at a lower ISO. So it's just kind of gone opposite there, and they took that away from me. Interestingly enough, in video mode, if you're using this as a video camera, it does stop down live and lets you see, because videographers need to see what's in focus and what's not in focus. For some reason, they took it away for still photographers. I think it's autofocus related, and I think it would be nice if they gave us the option to have it back when we're manually focusing, doing fine work like I'm talking about. All right, so a couple quick notes of things I would change with the camera regarding video, and I'm not going to hit them too hard and too long. One is that when you're using an external recorder via HDMI, like I am right now, if you're recording out, you can record 10-bit log video. That's a really high dynamic range video. I'd like to see the next camera use compact flash express cards that are really fast writing and be able to do that in camera instead of having to have an external field recorder. I think that would be really great. Another thing involving video is better audio preamps. This camera, if I just take the microphone into it, has a real loud hiss. There's a background hiss, and shooting video with it, it shoots beautiful video. But I tend to do audio through kind of a filtering device because I'm just not happy with the audio that comes into the camera through the microphone line in. So a little thing that I think could be improved, and Nikon isn't cannibalizing some fleet of professional video cameras. One quick other thing with video is that it'd be nice if there were a little red light on the front that shows when you're recording, since it has that 29-minute timeout. when I'm doing things like I'm doing right now, it would just be nice to see if that light winks out because you've gone past the limit. All right, so let's get back to stills. I would like when I'm in intervalometer mode, intervalometer just means I tell it to take a photograph every, say, 5 seconds or 10 seconds or 1 minute or every second. It's the kind of way I create time lapse. I'm telling it to take a photograph every so often for, say, 480 frames. Well, when you put it in silent capture mode, it's really nice because it uses almost no battery to do that. Everything on the camera is turned off, the viewfinder, the back LCD. The one thing that's a bummer is it turns off the top LCD too, and it doesn't give you a remaining frames counter. That's one thing that the D850 and the 500 and the other DSLRs do when you're in intervalometer mode. You can put them in silent mode and you get a little R36, 35, 34, 33 countdown, from 480 down to 0. And you can just at a glance look down at the camera and know how many frames are remaining, which kind of gives you an idea when your wife's on the phone saying, when are you going to be home? Well, there you go. So it'd be nice if they'd leave the top LCD on with just that remaining frames counter for the intervalometer. That would be really big for me. I think that the subject tracking mode in the automatic area focus mode, when you're photographing continuous action and you're in AFC, you're not in static mode, you're in AFC, you're in continuous autofocus where it keeps tracking things. The automatic area focus mode, the automatic area mode, is amazing, And if you're tracking fast-moving subjects with the camera panning with them, you don't need to select a focus point at all. I've done a whole video on that too. I'm going to link it. The difference is that when there's something moving and your camera isn't moving that much with it, it has a hard time tracking that kind of action. Think a bicycle coming from a long distance. Maybe there's 3 or 4 riders. You can hit your function 2 button and light up a tracking point that suddenly becomes activated, and then hit the autofocus button to start tracking that. And that's great. The problem is it's not quite ready for having fast movement with that, where you're tracking something and you're moving the camera fast with it. It's kind of one or the other at this point. So I find myself flipping back and forth. Let's say there's a bicyclist like coming toward me. I'm going to want that subject tracking because I'm not moving the camera much, but as they get close, I'm going to turn it off and then pan with them. I'd love to see them work to improve that so I can just keep that subject tracking in the frame. Sony's got subject tracking really down now that they're into their 4th generation of mirrorless cameras, and I'm sure Nikon will too. It's pretty amazing how much better it's gotten through firmware since the day they announced and released these cameras. The static AFS for subjects that aren't moving has always been amazing, but tracking motion was its real Achilles heel in the beginning, and it's gotten so much better now by firmware 3.0 that it competes. It does really well. It's frenetic having to switch back and forth for action that I'm doing this to track versus action that's kind of coming at me and I'm moving really slowly. So if they could combine that subject tracking to where it does a better job, as long as you keep the subject in frame with erratic motion, that would be awesome. I'd love to see a bigger buffer combined, and even if the camera's a little bit bigger, put a better preamp for video, audio, and a little bit bigger buffer, some more memory in there, and then put those new compact flash express cards in there with the architecture to feed that card as fast as it can take data, and give us the kind of buffer size that the D5 and the Nikon D500 have, so that when you're out there, particularly if you're in APS-C, if you're using the crop mode on the sensor, my hope is that suddenly you have a Nikon Z7-like camera where you can just shoot with the crop sensor, or you're shooting with the lower megapixel camera like the Z6, and it's able to just have kind of a bottomless buffer at that 10, 12, 14 frames per second rate, so that when you're shooting action like birds in flight or sports and you need to lay down a burst, you don't feel like you're going to run out. Right now, I've got about 11, 12 frames before it starts slowing down on the Z7, and maybe 14, 16 frames with the Z6, and it starts bogging down and slowing down. And I think just having that bigger buffer would make it a more capable action camera, especially combined with slight improvements in autofocus, which I'm sure are coming. Here's one thing that just small things. We're getting down to the minor things that I would change. One thing that irks me that it doesn't have that every pro level Nikon I've had for ages has, is the 2-button format. So there are 2 buttons on the body. They're on opposite sides. There's no way to accidentally hit them both. And on my D850 here, it's the delete button and the ISO button. If I press and hold those 2 buttons together while the camera's turned on for 1.5 seconds or 2 seconds, all of a sudden it starts flashing format, and I can choose with my wheel which card I want to format, and then press them once and release again, and it formats the card. I don't have to go diving through the menus to format my memory card. It really is annoying to me that every time I download my card and stick it back into the camera, I have to go into the menu and grab format and format the card, go through that menu setting. Even though I've got it in my menu near the top where it's easy to access, I just want to grab those 2 buttons while I'm having a conversation with someone and then tap them again and have the card clear. Another thing that comes directly from my love of the D850 and the D500 is the backlit button architecture. So the older DSLR, or the DSLRs, the modern DSLRs forever have had a switch where it's off, it's on, and then if you pull it a little past on, it lights up the top display. And the most recent Nikon cameras, before the mirrorless cameras, it also lit up almost every button, and the 4 Kings button up top, and there's even a little light that comes down to show you what drive mode you're in, and all the buttons on the back are backlit so that you can read all your controls in the dark, so you're Milky Way shooting with a real soft little glow to the buttons just by pulling that lever over. I want that same thing with the mirrorless camera. I know they're working to conserve battery power. Maybe it's a setting you could turn on and turn off, but I loved that. I loved not needing to turn on a red light on my headlamp. Now, granted, you should know where everything is and all the controls on your camera, but it's handy. Let's face it, it's handy to just be able to tap it and there are all the buttons glowing in front of you. Finally, and most controversially, it's down at the bottom of my list because I think it's less important, is dual card slots. I think dual card slots are handy. The Nikon D850 and D500 for ages, cameras have had dual card slots, whether it's 2 compact flash express cards. This one is a XQD card and an SD card. And I have never been in a situation where I thought it was life or death and I recorded to both cards at the same time. But I'm not a wedding shooter. You know, if I was about to shoot snow leopards in the Karakoram and I was on that shoot hoping for a snow leopard, I probably would set it to record to both cards just to be safe. I've always used it where my SD card, a fast SD card, records video, and the really fast card records stills so that I could have a faster burst rate and a longer lasting buffer. And it keeps my stills and video separate, so I can download the video from one card and download the stills from another card. I think that would be handy to have in this camera, and it would silence a lot of the people who get so upset and torqued about the fact that it's not a professional level camera because it doesn't have dual card slots. I mean, I have never heard of an XQD card failing. I think you'd have a hard time finding someone who's had an XQD card fail. They're about the most burly card ever made. And you know, be that as it may, people complain. It would silence the complainers, and it would give you that option of recording video to one card while you're recording stills to the other. So really for me, that's the only thing. I love the fact that these cameras accept all my absolutely fabulous modern f-glass lenses with autofocus and exposure just as good as it is with my other cameras. There's no letdown in performance using, say, my 70-200 FLED 2.8 lens or my 105 1.4 portrait lens. I love the in-body image stabilization. I love the control layout and format. I love how beautiful and crisp the viewfinder is, and being able to zoom into 100% on the image through the viewfinder with the tap of a button. I love being able to control my menus through the buttons, review images in bright light, through the viewfinder. The viewfinder is just wonderful as far as I'm concerned. It gives me all of the benefits of live view handheld. So yeah, I'm a huge fan, and I hope Nikon does a few of these things. Some of these things could be done in firmware. You know, I still stand by the fact that I'm sure that the fact that you can't zoom in and check depth of field and focus could be fixed with a pretty simple firmware update. It works in the video mode, it just doesn't work in still mode. I'm sure that they could do a firmware update to give us a clear view without any shooting data overlaid over the top of it as an option when cycling through view modes. But be that as it may, certainly in the next camera, I'd love to see some of these things integrated. And you know, if you've got other things you'd like to see, put them in the comments section. Shoot me an email. You know, I'm super super amenable. I had someone ask me a question recently about whether or not I think back button focus is unnecessary now with the modern mirrorless cameras, because the entire sensor is covered. You know, you can take your focus point clear from one side of the frame to the other side of the frame. There's no more just the center having focus points. So now that you can adjust your autofocus point wherever you want, why would you need back button focus anymore? And it's funny, I react to that like, well, that's never the reason I wanted back button focus. Primarily, I leave my focus point on the center point because it's the most accurate. And I use back button focus to decide when I want the autofocus activated. I generally leave my camera in AFC mode, autofocus continuous. There are certain situations where I go to autofocus single servo mode with the mirrorless camera. I'll talk about that in a second. But traditionally with DSLRs, and most of the time with this camera, just out and about shooting, I leave it in continuous mode. And as long as I hold the AF on button down with my thumb, it continues focusing. When I want to stop focusing, I just let off. I don't need it to lock because taking my thumb off locks it. And then I can independently shoot. Or I can frame something up with that most accurate center focus point, reshift, take my thumb off, and fire without it refocusing. I just feel like I shouldn't have it focus every time I touch the shutter button. Shooting is one thing, focusing is another. I think that the autofocus on the shutter was a feature that the camera companies added to their cameras to make them more accessible to the masses. They were trying to kind of, I hate to say dumb it down a little bit, but make these bigger cameras more accessible to people that weren't professional photographers and didn't want to have to learn how to use their thumb to focus independently of their finger to shoot. And I think that if you take the time to do that, it gives you more control. Focus is one function, shooting is another function. The only reason I could ever see to have the shutter and the focus be on the same finger is when you're shooting birds in flight and you're working with the tracking with, say, group focus or subject tracking with the joystick on the back of the camera, and you don't want to switch those jobs. You want to keep moving those tracking around with your thumb, and just whenever you shoot, it focuses. I could see that. That's the only situation I would do it in. I did mention that I'd say why I sometimes choose single servo mode with the mirrorless cameras, and that's simply because of its new low light autofocus. There's a mode in here in your autofocus settings in the custom settings menu for low light autofocus. I keep that turned on, and when you get into low lit situations, it does this magnificent job. It sort of slows down in AFS mode, and it locks focus with tremendous accuracy. I've found it can lock focus on a planet or a bright star when I'm out shooting the Milky Way. That good. So I do sometimes use that, particularly in low lit situations where I'm not shooting moving subjects. But so there you go. That answers one question that came in through the forums. You know, when you sign up for my office hours, and I really hope you'll join me, and I hope you'll share an image captured with a single focal length this week. There's a forum to put questions in, and I've been getting so many fantastic questions submitted by the people who are joining me. And those have been really fun 1 hour sessions. Again, Tuesday mornings, 10 a.m. Pacific, it's free. Sign up for that. Thanks again so much for liking these videos, sharing them with your friends, and subscribing to the channel. There's always a little icon in the bottom right of these videos where you can subscribe, and I invite you to do so. I think it's right there, if I'm pointing the right way. I think in kind of reverse for video. And I hope everybody and all their families are safe and sound in this weird time. Clearly I'm not out teaching workshops and traipsing around the world like I'm accustomed to, but I'm spending some real quality time with family, reconnecting with old friends and new friends via video apps on the computer, and having fun with these videos and spending time around home. I've been doing some home projects. I restained my 1,000 square foot wraparound porch on the house, and we've been doing landscaping, and I've been hanging stuff up in the garage that's been cluttering it. So, you know, and biggest thing of all, of course, is spending more time with my kids. So I hope that everyone is finding some positive and that everyone's and their families are safe and sound. So stay safe, don't stop shooting, don't stop editing, keep pushing, and we'll all be out there again soon. Thanks so much. We'll see you next week.